A groundbreaking report published by Reuters and financial organizations has just ripped through the velvet curtain of the world's #1 economy. The headline is so shocking that many find it hard to believe. The United States is the largest recipient of aid and loans from China. We always assume the US is the global benefactor, the one dispensing aid. Yet it turns out that in the shadowy flows of finance, America is the planet's biggest debtor. And ironically, the party holding the US promissory note, the one quietly pumping blood to keep the American heart beating, is none other than Beijing. This situation is analogous to walking into the world's most opulent gold-plated mansion. The owner drives a supercar, hosts lavish banquets, and employs a fully armed security detail. But the stark reality is that the mansion is mortgaged, the luxury car is leased, the security team's payroll is funded by a loan from the neighbor he despises the most. Why has a military superpower allowed itself to fall into a debt trap set by its primary rival? Why does China, despite being systematically contained by the US, continue to rescue America by lending it money? And what global tragedy will this bizarre creditor-debtor relationship lead to when the $38 trillion debt bomb finally explodes? A stark reality. An indictment of the century. The latest report from Reuters shatters an illusion that has lasted 2 decades. We see the US funneling tens of billions of dollars in aid to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, and we assume America is too rich to flush with cash to save the world. But while the US pours money out to the world, China is the one pouring money in to sustain the colossal US spending machine. The numbers speak for themselves. For over 20 years, China has been the largest foreign creditor to the US, holding at one point over $1.3 trillion in US Treasury bonds. The US spends more than it earns, with its budget consistently exceeding the $1 trillion mark annually. To compensate, Washington prints a special commodity, the Treasury bond. They sell it to the world with the promise, I will pay interest. I am highly trustworthy. And who has enough cash to buy? China, the planet's manufacturing powerhouse, where every container leaving Shenzhen port represents a flow of USD into Beijing's pockets. But instead of holding cash, which is eroded by inflation, China is compelled to reinvest, and the safest choice is US Treasury bonds, the world's deepest and most liquid financial market. The result is a bizarre loop that economists playfully call the love-hate loop. Chinese workers toil for 12 hours a day to produce inexpensive goods. Americans simply print paper, inject credit, and consume limitlessly to buy those goods. The dollars China earns are then lent back to the US by Beijing in the form of treasury bonds. Washington, in turn, uses that very borrowed money to boost its defense budget past $800 billion annually. Deploying aircraft carriers, bombers, and military bases across the Pacific to contain China, it's a paradox bordering on irony. China is nurturing its own greatest geopolitical adversary, and the US is using Chinese money to contain China. If Hollywood wrote the script, audiences would probably dismiss it as implausible. But this is the naked truth of the 21st century. This is why experts at SD Data call the current system a financial structure that is both symbiotic and self-destructive. Beijing's creditor pivot, the financial mad doctrine. At this point, you might ask, if the US is so deeply in debt, why is it still thriving as if nothing is wrong? And why doesn't China, the largest creditor, simply call in the debt? This is the hidden angle that almost no economic expert dares to openly discuss on television, as it reveals a chilling truth about the structure of global financial power. Financial mad, mutually assured destruction, the economic version of the nuclear standoff doctrine. For years, China held over $1.1 trillion in US bonds, essentially a financial nuclear bomb in their hands. The theory is simple. If Beijing were to mass dump all these bonds onto the market, US bond prices would instantly collapse, and interest rates would skyrocket to 10% or even 20%, similar to the 1980 Volcker shock, but infinitely stronger. The Wall Street stock market would evaporate trillions of dollars in days, and the US economy would descend into chaos. But this America-ending scenario would drag China down with an even worse consequence. Americans are the biggest customers for Chinese goods. If the US plunges into crisis, consumption will collapse. Who will buy phones, appliances, electric cars, clothes, and shoes from Guangdong, Zhejiang, and Shanghai? Chinese factories would shut down en masse. Millions of workers would be unemployed, and social unrest could flare up like a torch. The Beijing regime would face the risk it fears most: instability. Therefore, both the US and China are trapped in a vicious cycle. However, the story has recently taken a different turn. Beijing no longer wants to be locked into this game. They have begun a silent, but extremely aggressive de-risking campaign to distance themselves from the US. Data shows that China has reduced its holdings of US bonds to under $770 billion and is continuing to sell. They are not mass dumping in a confrontational move, as that would be self-sabotage. Instead, they are selling slowly, in small increments, and, most importantly, they are selling to restructure their asset composition. China is using the proceeds to buy gold. The People's Bank of China (PBOC) has been buying gold net for 18 consecutive months, the longest buying streak since modern data records began. Beijing is exchanging its promissory notes and asset dependent on Washington's credibility and ability to repay for a tangible asset that no one can freeze, confiscate, or manipulate. Gold cannot be frozen by any nation. It is outside the SWIFT system. It is not an asset that NATO can simply lock down with an administrative order. This gold buying action is a chilling message from Beijing to Washington. We no longer trust you. And more importantly, we do not want to be held hostage by you again. A lesson from Russia. When the creditor is robbed in broad daylight. Why is China so afraid of being held hostage? This leads us to a third character in this story, the one who inadvertently taught China a bloody lesson: Russia. Consider this shocking event, a financial blow that changed the global order in a matter of hours. When the Russia-Ukraine conflict erupted, the US and the West did something modern history had never witnessed. They froze and confiscated $300 billion in assets belonging to the Russian central bank. Essentially, Russia was a creditor depositing its assets in Western banks. But in the blink of an eye, Washington made a simple declaration: that money is no longer Russia's. No lawsuit needed, no court required. A single executive order was sufficient. For Beijing, this was not just news. It was a nightmare unfolding right before their eyes. Xi Jinping and China's financial officials immediately understood one thing. If China were to unify Taiwan by force one day, their $3 trillion in foreign exchange reserves scattered across the US, Europe, and the global banking system could vanish overnight, just like Russia's. This is no longer military warfare. It is financial warfare, where the US holds the ultimate power. When the rule of law is weaponized, when finance becomes the artillery, the borrower us becomes stronger than the lender China. The Russian shock was the final curtain pull for China. Beijing realized that holding too many US bonds was not a strength, but a fatal weakness. They realized that the US, being the largest debtor, did not equate to Chinese power. On the contrary, China was leaving its assets in the hands of its adversary, who could flip the switch at any moment. This is why China does not dare to mass dump bonds. It's not because they fear the US, but because the current system ties both countries together. The Reuters report saying the US is the largest recipient of loans from China is correct, but it reflects a legacy of the past. The current trend is that China is cutting off the blood supply to the US. And when this flow stops, the ailing body of US finance will begin to convulse. The interest trap and the specter of default. Let's delve deeper into the US's internal wounds to see how they are festering. Currently, US public debt has surpassed the $38 trillion mark, but the debt figure is less frightening than the interest payments. Due to the Federal Reserve Fed hiking interest rates to combat inflation, the interest the US government must pay to creditors like China and Japan has soared. For the first time in history, the US is spending more money on debt interest payments over $1 trillion than on national defense. Let's pause and reflect on this. The number one superpower is spending more just to service its debt than to defend the country. This is a typical Ponzi finance scheme. The US must borrow new debt to pay the interest on old debt. What if China and other countries stop buying new debt? The US would be forced to print money to buy its own debt, resulting in hyperinflation, the dollar losing value, soaring prices for gas and bread in the US, plunging American society into chaos. Wall Street analysts are whispering about a failed auction scenario, the day the US Treasury issues bonds and no one buys them. At that point, the US would be in technical default, and China, as the largest historical lender, holds the power to decide when that day arrives. China is not just withdrawing money. They are executing a more profound strategy, the internationalization of the yuan, instead of lending to the US. China is using its surplus to lend to Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, requiring these countries to repay with resources like oil and minerals or transact using the yuan. Recently, Saudi Arabia hinted at accepting the yuan for oil, a direct threat to the survival of the Petrodollar system, an empire built over 50 years. This is the pulling the firewood from under the cauldron tactic. If the world doesn't need the dollar to buy oil, they won't need to stockpile US bonds to hold dollar reserves. And if no one buys US bonds, who will lend the US money to maintain an $800 billion military? The US is being encircled not by warships, but by China's currency swap agreements. Beijing is building a parallel financial system to replace SWIFT. They are creating a new world where the US can default without sinking the entire world. Conclusion: the death knell for the dollar. Returning to the image of the gold-plated mansion at the beginning of the article. The homeowner, the US, is still partying, but the neighbor, China, has started to stop sending over supplies. The information from the Telegraph is not just dry figures. It is the death knell for the era of the US dollar's exorbitant privilege. The US has grown accustomed to spending on someone else's credit card for the past 50 years. But now, the Chinese bank is gradually closing its transaction counter. This situation shows us a truth. Current power lies not in weaponry, but in the ability of financial self-sufficiency. The US may have 11 aircraft carriers, but if they have to borrow money from a rival to fuel them, those aircraft carriers are just harmless floating iron masses against a financial flick of the finger from Beijing. What will the US do? Engage in war to erase the debt, or accept austerity and lose its superpower status? We are living through the greatest power transition in history, and it is unfolding right on the financial market ticker. What do you think about the future of the dollar? And will the US default? Let's hear your comments.